In our last lecture, we looked at the human relations school. We observed that the approach essentially declared that it was good business to look after the worker. In this lecture, we turn our attention to the institutional school. The institutional school uses theory from social theory in particular to develop a view of institutions, the way they interact, and the way they affect society. It provides a way of viewing institutions outside of the traditional view of economics and management by explaining why so many organizations have similar organizational structures, what we call isomorphism, even though they evolved in different ways. Moreover, they look at how institutions shape the behavior of individual members. We have to remind ourselves that institutions interact with one another in ways that can be studied and understood. In fact, when we looked at late 19th century and early 20th century, sociologists in particular began to systematize this study. For example, Max Weber focused on the way bureaucracies and institutions were coming to dominate our society, as we discussed in a previous lecture. Much of the research within institutionalism deals with the pervasive influence of institutions on human behavior through rules, through norms, and other frameworks. Previous theories held that institutions can influence individuals to act in one of two ways. They can cause individuals within institutions to maximize benefits. This is seen as regulative institutions. They can influence individuals to act out of duty or an awareness of what one is supposed to do. These are considered normative institutions. In the 1980s, new institutionalism, sometimes called neo-institutionalism, has seen to revive focus on the study of institutions. New institutionalism recognizes that institutions operate in an environment consisting of other institutions. This is called the institutional environment. Every institution is influenced by the broader environment, or in simpler terms, institutional peer pressure. In this environment, the main goal of organizations is to survive. In order to do so, they need to do more than succeed economically. They need to establish legitimacy within the world of institutions. In other words, institutional theorists assert that the institutional environment can strongly influence the development of formal structures in an organization. Innovative structures that improve technical efficiency in early adopting organizations are legitimized in the environment. Ultimately, these innovations reach a level of legitimization where failure to adopt them is seen as irrational and negligent, or they may become legal mandates. At this point, new and existing organizations will adopt the structural form even if the form doesn't improve efficiency. An important contribution to new institutionalism was to add a cognitive type influence. This perspective adds that instead of acting under rules or based on obligation, individuals act because of conceptions. Individuals make certain choices or perform certain actions, not because they fear punishment or attempt to conform. Neither do they do so because an action is appropriate or the individual feels some sort of social obligation. Instead, the cognitive element of new institutionalism suggests that individuals make certain choices because they can conceive of no other alternative. Put in different terms, these institutional myths are merely accepted ceremoniously in order for the organization to gain or maintain legitimacy in the institutional environment. Organizations adopt the vocabularies of structure prevalent in their environment, such as specific job titles, procedures, and organizational roles. The adoption and prominent display of these institutionally acceptable trappings of legitimacy helps preserve an aura of organizational action based on good faith. Legitimacy in the institutional environment helps ensure organizational survival. However, these formal structures of legitimacy can reduce efficiency and hinder the organization's competitive position in their technical environment. To reduce this negative effect, organizations often will decouple their technical core from these legitimizing structures. Organizations will minimize or ceremonialize evaluation and neglect program implementation to maintain external and potentially internal confidence in formal structures while reducing their efficiency impact. Organizational structure, which used to arise from the rules of efficiency, now arise from the institutional constraints imposed by the state. The efforts to achieve rationality with uncertainty and constraint leads to homogeneity of structures or an institutional isomorphism. As an innovation sort of spreads, a threshold is reached beyond which adoption provides legitimacy rather than improves performance. We can therefore argue that isomorphism is a constraining process that forces one unit in a population of an organization to resemble another sort of units within an organization that faces the same set of environmental conditions. Organizations will adopt similar structures as a result of three types of pressures: coercive pressures, mimic pressures, and normative pressures. Coercive pressures come from legal mandates or pressures from other organizations in which the organization is dependent upon, and by cultural expectations from society. That is, there are particular structures and practices that are often reflections of, as well as responses to rules, laws, conventions, paradigms built into the wider environment. Some might be, for instance, governmental mandates. Some can be derived from contract law or financial reporting requirements. Organizations are increasingly homogeneous within their given domains and increasingly organized around rituals of conformity to wider institutions. When we look at mimic pressures, what we're suggesting here is that there are pressures to copy successful forms that arise during periods of high uncertainty. Uncertainty encourages imitation. We can also see that organizational models can be diffused through employee migration. Finally, normative pressures to homogeneity comes from the similar attitudes and approaches of professional groups and associations brought into the organization through hiring practices. There are pressures brought about by professions, for example, the licensing and crediting of educational achievements. Norms developed during education are entered into the organization. Or perhaps there are interorganizational networks that span organizations. Inter-hiring between existing organizations also encourages isomorphism. Individuals with the same educational background can generally approach problems in a similar fashion. Moreover, we can suggest there's a socialization on the job reinforcing these conformities. The similarities forged by these three pressures allows organizations to interact with each other more easily and to build legitimacy. There are various predictors of isomorphic change which we can look at from an organizational perspective and a field perspective. We're first going to look at the organizational perspective. From an organizational perspective, the predictors of isomorphic change is as follows. First, the more dependent of an organization, the more like it will become. In other words, when an organization is dependent on other organizations, they start to copy its forms and structures. A second sort of predictor is that the greater the centralization of resource supply, the more it will change to resemble the organizations it is dependent upon. A third predictor is this idea that the more uncertainty, the more an organization would model the structure after successful organizations. The more ambiguous the goals, the more an organization will mimic a successful one to establish legitimacy. Another predictor is this idea that the greater reliance we have using academic credentials to choose staff, the greater we're going to find that the organizations are going to start copying each other and looking like each other. Moreover, in a similar strand, the greater the participation of members in professional organizations, the more alike organizations will be. From a field level perspective, the predictors are as follows. First, The greater the extent the field is dependent upon a single source, the higher level of isomorphism. The more interaction the field has with the state, the more isomorphism occurs. The fewer the number of organizational models, the quicker the isomorphism. Another sort of predictor is this idea that the more technological uncertainty or goal ambiguity, the greater the rate of isomorphism. The more professionalism in the field, the greater isomorphic sort of pressures that we see. It is worthwhile pointing out that there are, in fact, subfields of institutionalism. Normative institutionalism, for instance, is seen as the original new institutionalism. Much of what we've discussed thus far relates to a normative view of institutionalism. It is essentially using social theory and sort of way of interpreting institutions. Normative institutionalists hold that a logic of appropriateness guides the behavior of actors within an institution. The norms and formal rules of institutions will shape the actions of those acting within them. It defines institutions more broadly by including the symbol systems, cognitive scripts, and moral templates. Hence, it breaks down the divide between institutions and culture. Now, another sort of subfield in institutionalism is rational choice institutionalism. Rational choice institutionalism draws heavily from rational choice theory, but it's not identical to it. Proponents of this theory argue that political actors' rational choices are constrained. There's this sort of bounded rationality. Rational choice theorists also argue that institutions are rules that govern the behavior between individuals and that actions are made in the interest of the individual. Finally, there's historical institutionalism. As the name suggests, this version of institutionalism states that history matters. Paths chosen or designed early on in the existence of an institution tend to be followed throughout the institution's development. It thus follows that institutions will have an inherent agenda based on the pattern of development, both informally, the way things are generally done, and formally, laws, rules, and institutional interaction. A key concept in historical institutionalism is path dependency. The historical track of a given institution or polity will result almost inevitably in certain types of occurrences. This theory does not hold, however, that institutional paths will forever be inevitable. There are critical junctures that may allow rapid change at a time of great crisis. Studies suggest when there's a high level of consensus and cooperation within the institutional environment, diffusion of innovative structures is steady and long-lasting. However, when the institutional environment is contentious and unfocused, the adoption of innovative structures is slow and tentative. Other studies confirm the hypothesis that while early organizations adopt a new form to improve efficiency, later organizations adopt a structural form to maintain legitimacy. In fact, quantitative models predicted civil service adoption based on city characteristics, notably in early time periods, but failed to predict adoption in later time periods. This concludes our lecture on the institutional school. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at the final approach to examining organizations. We'll be looking at organizational ecology as a philosophy for understanding how organizations behave.